Ready, KG? Yes, it is the 14th. All right, testing. How does this sound, KG? Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Stephanie Borger, and on behalf of the Adult Christian Ed Committee, I want to thank you all so much for being willing to engage in this difficult topic. This is week 2 of our adult Christian education class called The Crisis in Gaza: Israel, Palestine, the Bible, and Christ's Call to Peacemaking. Last week, Byron Borger kicked us off on this series with an impassioned introduction to the Christian call to be engaged in the pressing issues of the day and to work for peace and justice. So if you missed that last week, I would encourage you to go back and watch the recording. You can find it on the church website or the Facebook page or the YouTube channel, Adult Ed from April 7th. So do check that out last week. Last time, we also invited you to write questions that you might have on the little doodle pads that are in the pews. And I would continue to invite you to do that. If you have questions, we have a lot of ground that we hope to cover. I know there's a million things we could talk about, a million directions we could go in. So if you have specific questions, please do write those down on the doodle pads. If you are watching online, you can type your questions in the Facebook chat and we'll check those. We won't necessarily get to all of them today or even next week, but over the next 4 weeks, we do hope to get to the questions that you have. And so, we got a couple of great questions last time, and Byron Borger is going to start us off addressing one of them, even though he's not here in person. He recorded a little video, because of course he could not limit himself to just 40 minutes, so he wanted to get a little more talking in. So here he is addressing one of the great questions that was asked last time.
Everyone, I'm sorry I can't be with you there today. I'm at a conference up in Michigan, speaking at a Festival of Faith and Writing at Calvin University, and I really wish I could be there, but thank you for allowing me to visit here just a bit. I hope you were with us last week when we laid out the groundwork for this course on the crisis in Gaza. Some of the things that I said, you may want to go look at it online if you weren't there. Then we need a biblical perspective. We need a balanced Christian mindset, having the mind of Christ and allowing the scriptures to speak to us as we make our decisions. I named that favorite verse of mine in Chronicles where it mentions the sons of Issachar, who understood the times but also knew what God's people should do. And I suggested that our Christian Ed Committee here at First Pres really wants to nurture sons and daughters of Issachar, people that know the scriptures well and know the times, and bring together the current events of our day and what it means to live faithfully into those areas with God's grace and guidance. So anyway, we looked at a bunch of things like that, and one of the things I sort of ended quickly with was the biblical call to peacemaking. It's a non-negotiable thing with Jesus to turn the other cheek and love our neighbor well, even our enemies. And one of the themes, even in the Old Testament, is that when Israel trusted their weapons, things went south for them. It didn't go well when they trusted their war horses or their chariots, the best weapon systems of the day. God said, no, not by power, not by might, but by my spirit. Well, one of the questions that came out of that, and I'm so glad that people wrote down little questions. You can do that again on the doodle pads there if you want and turn them into Stephanie. But one of the good questions was, well, does Israel have a right to defend itself? That's a good question, and one we should start with. And so let me just quickly address that. There's much more that could be said, but very quickly I would just want to say, well, yes, of course. At least in the secular nation states of the world, every nation has the right to defend itself, and no one would suggest that Israel should not be concerned about its own security. We talked about the model of pro, being pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace. And so part of that certainly means a security for each nation state and people group in the region. So yes, of course. So that's the easy answer. A deeper question, though, that it evokes is why a question like that is important. And it is, but why a question like that comes up? In other words, why wasn't the question, or did the people in Gaza, the refugees, have a right to defend themselves? I mean, they are some of the poorest people on the planet, some of the most bureaucratically regimented with no freedom or dignity often for decades living in refugee camps, not even able to go to their own work or play without permission and so forth, and always under the threat of the repression of the occupation. And Israel, themselves threatened, is one of the largest military presences, certainly in the Middle East and perhaps in the world. We give them billions and billions and billions of dollars in aid every single year. So any hope of swords being beat into plowshares, which is our dream and our biblical hope, is hardly possible when Israel is the larger military presence in the area. So could Israel defend itself? Of course. Should other people be allowed to defend themselves? Well, of course. And who is the bigger threat? And who are the victims we most need to care with in the spirit of Matthew 25? It seems to me that certainly the current situation would lead us to ask the question, what about the people of Palestine? The Muslims and the Christians and the others that are there. But of course, the question also evokes this, and this is the big answer. I only can mention it quickly. Any nation that has the right to defend itself militarily would have to ask, in what manner do they defend themselves? In the history of the church, some people, like Mennonites and others, take Jesus' call to be peacemakers seriously and literally. They turn the other cheek. They think war is a sin and that holiness calls us to avoid violence at all times. The Presbyterian tradition has generally not believed that, and we have stood with the 4th century scholars like St. Augustine and into the next centuries with Aquinas, who developed what is known as the just war theory. The just war theory is a theory that's been shaped and developed over centuries, also in our Reformed tradition, to suggest that if a nation needs to go to war, it is always a last resort. And it is always done with certain ethical rules and principles that guide a moral understanding of war fighting. Now again, Mennonites that take the Bible sort of literally say, no, you don't do that at all. That's just a worldly notion of trying to make war a little nicer. But most of us know that in a fallen world, nation states have to sometimes, sadly, involve themselves in some kind of military operations. And God gives the authority of the state to be able to do that. So what are some of the theories or the principles of the just war theory? Well, there's too many to mention, but basically there are two different sorts of theories. How and when you go to war, and then the way you fight when you do go to war. There has to be a just cause. There has to be a legal nation state declaring it so. There has to be then, when you go to war, a sense of proportionality. It always has to be the absolute last-ditch effort after every other nonviolent means has been attempted and found wanting. And so we go as long as we can trying to resolve things and willing to call off the military the moment there's any glimpse of a ceasefire possible. That's the just war theory that has traditionally been held for centuries in the ethical mindset of the Christian tradition, most Christian tradition, and has therefore then shaped, back from the time of the Reformation on, into the way nation states conduct themselves, even now sort of encoded in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other things like that. There's sort of war trial things and war criminal things. That all comes from the just war theory, from the Christian tradition that said there's ways in which you fight, and there's moral ways in which you cannot fight. You can't bomb civilians, and so forth. Now here's the thing. When there's a nation state fighting a nation state, it's fairly clear and crisp. You can determine if the just war theories are really being held and followed. When you're fighting terrorists, bands of people that are not even governments, and they hide in amongst civilians and in hospitals, as Hamas does, it becomes that much more complicated, and I would say that much more urgent, that the just war principles be carefully followed. Is Israel following them? Absolutely not. Could Israel do a much, much better job? Yes, absolutely. At this point, with 30,000 people dead, many of them sick, many of them wounded, many of them children, many of them old ladies, civilians and others, it is just an abomination. They have not even come close to abiding the traditional just war ethics that has guided Western warfighting for centuries. Many wars are not fought in the proper way. But our call as Christians, if we're not going to go the whole way arguing for nonviolence, we should at least ask nation states to follow the ethical regime known as the just war theory and the principles like proportionality and avoiding civilian deaths and stopping as soon as possible, because vengeance and winning is never the goal. The goal of the just war theory is always a reordered sense of public justice. Well, anyway, that's the just war theory that should guide and shape any nation that chooses to defend itself. Hamas is not even considered a nation state, and their attacks and atrocities last fall are beyond the pale. But Israel's now retaliation is certainly not in keeping with the just war efforts either. So we want to prophetically say with tears in our eyes that both sides are wrong, and we need to call them to a higher common ground, being pro-peace, even as we stand with the victims in Gaza, and with those that are so frightened and doing evil things amongst the right-wing regime in Israel. That's my sense of things anyway. So yes, the question asked is a good one, and we can talk about it more as we go on. Thank you for being a learning community here at First Pres and for allowing us to have these pretty tough conversations. And if I haven't misspoken at all, I'll be back in a week and we can go at it again. Thank you so very, very much, and have a good class this morning.
Well, thank you, Byron, if you're listening from Michigan. Just a little bit more detail about the just war theory. As he mentioned, lots of different thinkers dating back to St. Augustine have talked about this as an ethical framework for how you determine if a war is ethical or not. And the two main components are why you go to war and how you conduct yourself in war. The first principle, justice in going to war, is sometimes described with the Latin phrase jus ad bellum. And there are generally agreed to be at least 6 major components to determine if you have a just cause for going to war. First, the reason you're going to war has to be just. You can't fight a just war in search of unjust aims. That should be obvious. Second, to be just, the war has to be a last resort. You have to have exhausted all of the other peaceful means for achieving the goal. Third, the war has to be declared by a proper authority. We usually think of nation states. This is why random individuals or terror cells are generally considered not to be able to engage in a just war. It does get complicated in situations, for example, where the leaders of a state are a puppet regime, or in a group of people that don't have a legitimate government. It can get complicated. But that the war has to be declared by a proper authority is a tenet of the just war theory. Fourth, that you have to go to war with the right intention. So in service of a more just society, for self-defense, for example, not because you are trying to aggrandize your own nation, not because you are hoping to actually acquire wealth or land. Fifth, for a war to be just, it has to have a reasonable chance of success, because there are always casualties and violence and death. It's not considered ethical to undertake all of that unless there's actually a good chance you'll accomplish your goal. And sixth, the end that you're hoping to achieve has to be proportional to the means. So those are generally the 6 criteria to determine if you are just in going to war in the first place. And then the second major component, justice while you're fighting the war, the how, sometimes in Latin called jus in bello. And the 2 basic tenets of this criteria are, first, distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. While there are almost always inevitably civilian casualties, every effort has to be made not to attack indiscriminately, not just to carpet bomb residential areas, not to target civilians, especially not hospitals or schools or churches or aid workers or journalists. And then second, the actions undertaken in war have to be proportional to the object that is desired, trying to minimize destruction, minimize casualties as much as possible. So the just war theory says, in a nutshell, in order for a war to be just, it has to be undertaken for just reasons and in a just way. So, as Byron uses the phrase pro, when we talk about being pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian and pro-peace, that doesn't mean that we can't criticize the leaders of either group, that we want to absolutely care about the dignity and the safety and the rights of Palestinian people and Israeli people, but we can and legitimately should criticize the actions of either group's leaders when they are not ethical and not just, and that's a very fair thing to do. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize actions taken by the government of Israel, and it's not anti-Palestinian to criticize actions taken by terrorists like Hamas. So hopefully we can all agree, at least on that basic framework. Now, one thing that I know we have a lot of questions about is how did we get to this situation that we are in right now in the first place? And the history is complex. We could spend a lot of time talking about it, and perhaps we'll delve into a bit more as we go on. But just to get us started, we have a brief video, it's about 10 minutes long, that is an overview of the history of about the last 100 years, basically since World War I, of how we got to this situation. This was created 8 years ago, this video, so it doesn't take account of the current escalation in violence, but it's a pretty good overview of the 20th century and early 21st century. So we'll take it away. Thanks, KG.
About the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there.
You get better when you're not blamed for a condition you can't control.
After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, But in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of the
stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and flames.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years. And a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. But the second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence. The most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
So as I said, that was done in 2016, so 8 years ago. But that things are unstable, that they're likely to get much worse, we're certainly seeing that. That was, of course, a bird's eye view, and I know there was a lot crammed in there. So if you have specific questions, please do write them on the notepads. I also put the link to that video in the comments on the Facebook feed. So if you want to go back and watch it again, you can look for the recording of this class on the church's Facebook page, and in the comments I'm linking all the videos, because there was a lot there. But hopefully that kind of gives us at least a bird's eye view of the last 100 years or so, and how it was really after World War I that things started getting incredibly unstable in the aftermath of the British colonization. So, I apologize that we are watching so many videos today, but I have one more for us, as we're all still kind of getting our legs under us, trying to wrap our heads around some of the background of this whole situation. I think it is helpful to hear from folks who have much more immediate context than I do or than most of us do. So this third video that I have for us was created by a group from the United Methodist Church, and it features a number of different Palestinian Christians, as well as some folks from the United Methodist Church's mission organization who are staff who live in Palestine and work there. And this video focuses on the city of Bethlehem, which is not in Gaza, but it is in the West Bank. And this video was made, I want to say in 2019, so again, several years ago, prior to the current increase in violence. But it interviews a lot of folks on the ground who live in the West Bank, in the Palestinian territory, just talking about what life is like, especially as a Christian. We often sort of stereotype conflicts in the Middle East as being between Jews and Muslims. But of course, in Palestine, there is a significant Christian population, and they are some of the most ancient Christian communities that exist anywhere on earth, the land where Jesus is from. And so this is a video that has some interviews with folks who are Christians in Palestine, specifically in Bethlehem in the West Bank. Now, again, this is on YouTube, so there are some really unfortunate ad breaks, and I apologize for that in advance. There are some very obnoxious ads that come at inopportune times, so I hope they're not too distracting. But I will once again put the link to this video in the comments on Facebook. The title of this video is Bethlehem, Walking with Palestinian Christians, made by some folks from the United Methodist Church.
My knowledge about Bethlehem was from the Bible, and my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was born here. And of course, a lot of people, they want to come here to visit and see places. But for me, it was a surprise and shock to see how hard and how difficult is the situation.
I remember being on the bus and hearing the guy kept talking about the wall. What wall is he talking about? So I came into this situation having absolutely no idea that there was any sort of conflict or that Palestine even existed.
I was actually born in the States. My father's Palestinian and my mother's American, but I was raised here in Bethlehem. I had quite a few bad experiences talking with Christians in the U.S. I was kicked out of 2 churches, technically asked to leave another 2, accused of being a Muslim spy, accused of being a terrorist, that we're all Muslim, that we all condone violence, that we hate the West and the U.S. So those are some of the greatest misconceptions, I'd say.
My name is Katerina. I'm acting field coordinator in Odessa.
I'm Vladimir, team leader, Rapid Disposal Team, Kharkiv, Ukraine.
Hello, my name is Svat. I'm communications officer and
these are some of the items that we found in the street that the soldiers from the tower throw at us. You can see the gas canisters, the rubber-coated bullets, hand stun grenades, live ammunition.
I can remember very clearly standing in the Garden of Gethsemane and just crying. How can this be the Holy Land? How can this be the place of peace? Because that's not what I realize the people who are living here are experiencing. It's sad. There are these great big red signs. They always put them on both sides of the road. They're in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and it says, danger. You are entering into Area A. Strictly forbidden for Israeli citizens to enter Area A. It could be dangerous and you may even die. You come into Bethlehem and if you don't know anything about it, you read these signs and you think, who is it that lives inside this place? Ugh. Millions of people come to this place every year. Millions of Christians come and they don't experience what the Palestinians experience, and they don't experience what I experienced. Going through checkpoints and being stopped and being questioned because of your religion. And how in the world do you expect me to go back to the U.S. and live my normal life after seeing this? The wall is a huge separation barrier that exists between Israel and the West Bank. Israel started constructing it in 2002 with the idea that this would be a security fence or a security wall that would prevent further uprisings of the Palestinians. If you're an Israeli, you talk about the West Bank. This is the area of Judea and Samaria that is under the control of the Palestinian Authority. But if you're a Palestinian, you don't use the term West Bank because you use the term Palestine because this land to them has been Palestine forever. After the first uprising of the Palestinians, there were what we call the Oslo Accords, and that was like they wanted to come up with a way that the Palestinians could have control over some of their land. So what they did is they divided it into 3 different areas. They call them areas A, Area B, and Area C. City centers like Bethlehem and Ramallah and Jericho are considered Area A, and they're under control of the Palestinian Authority. As you get further out from the cities, you move into what they call Area B, where it's like the Palestinian Authority has some control over picking up garbage and this sort of thing, but they don't have any real authority over what happens in Area B. And then even further out from Area B into the more rural areas is Area C. Now, this land is supposed to belong to the Palestinians, but the Palestinian Authority has basically no control over it whatsoever.
Bras, then you might want to check this out.
I hate regular bras. I'm a 34.
This piece of land was bought by my grandfather in 1916, where Palestinians used to buy land without registration. The family worked here, lived satisfied and happy farming and planting different kind of trees until 1991, where Israeli government declared this piece of land as a state land. But this is a private property, it's not a state land. 27 years struggling in front of the Israeli court. They kept postponing the case to find an excuse to confiscate the land. You know, as Palestinians, we live here under Israeli military laws. They say if you do not use your land 3 years, it is automatically considered as a state land. The idea of postponing kept postponing to keep us under stress, to push us to leave or to push us to violence. So we saw ourselves in front of 2 options, whether to continue struggle or to leave. But we say we are not leaving and we are not reacting. We want to continue our work, acting in a positive way.
It's difficult because this is supposed to be Palestine, and this was land that is inside the Green Line that had been given to them, yet they can't get in any Area C. No Palestinians can build buildings. If they live in Area C, they can't redo their bathroom. They're not allowed to make any updates or any changes to their homes because they live in what's known as Area C.
When we talk to many Christian leaders and normal Christians, pilgrims who come to this land, we realize that, as I usually say, by default, they have already a perspective, a worldview about this land, about the situation, in particular about the conflict. They have a certain way in which they look to the Israeli and a certain way in which they look to the Palestinian. They come with a certain assumption about who's good and who's bad, without really not just any knowledge about the situation. And also with a theology that, whether they know it or not, intentionally or not intentionally, favors one people over the other, and many times a theology that is harmful to us Palestinians. For example, the fact that this is a Jewish land, that God gave this land to the Jewish people as an eternal possession, and all of a sudden we say, but wait a minute, we happen to be living here. Are we against God's will? Where is justice in all of that?
Sometimes the media doesn't played a fair role. And they don't know from the news what they will expect to see here or experience. But my advice to everyone willing to come as a pilgrim or visitor to the land, open your heart so you can see and you can listen to the Lord's voice to you.
I was meeting with a friend yesterday, a friend of a friend, and a friend of mine encouraged this seminary student to do his best while in the land to meet me. And he was part of a prominent Christian evangelical seminary students who are here for 3 weeks. And he came along to Bethlehem to meet me. And I said, so where's the rest of the group? He said, well, I had to leave. They are in a pottery class in somewhere in Jerusalem. And I thought, so what's more interesting and beneficial for seminarians, future leaders, to meet Palestinian Christians who have been living here, witnessing here, to listen about how we deal with occupation, how we try to build bridges with Muslims and Jews, how we live as a small minority here, yet part of the community, or listening about excavations, about things that happened 2,000 years ago. And he's speechless. He said, this is what we're here for. And probably we're going to come to Bethlehem for 2 hours to visit the Nativity Church, in and out and leave. Is this the right way to do it? And I'm talking about seminarians here, not just typical church groups. We somehow ignore suffering. We become impassionate about issues for the sake of doing a religious duty.
Every Jew, like any Jew, if they see an Arab walking beside them in the mall or anything and they spoke in Arabic, they think we're gonna just have a bomb or something. And I think it's scary for them being near us. They think we're gonna stab one of them or something, and we think that they're gonna do the same thing to us. So it's scary being around them.
They can't leave this place freely. They don't have the freedom of movement. They don't go on dates to the movies because there aren't movies here.
We're kind of present because we can barely go out of Palestine, and it's only in Palestine.
What's one of the scariest side effects of type 2? Losing a foot! Anyone who's been on metformin for...
Sometimes you see things walking to work in the morning and you see them holding a young boy going to school, asking him for identifications. And he's just a young boy. It's so hard for us to see this.
It's very difficult for children to reach us. And it is because of the separation barrier, it's because of the checkpoints. It's not easy, it's sometimes very difficult to get permits. Sometimes some mothers, they don't get the permit, so another member of the family joins the child. It's a big challenge.
Sometimes they ask me where I'm from, and I tell them America, and they just let me go on through. They don't really care. But there was one evening I was coming back in, and the soldier must have been really young, I don't know, 17, 18 years old. And he asked me where I was from, and I told him America like I always do. And he said, do you know you're going into Bethlehem? Like, uh-huh. He said, do you want to go into Bethlehem? Like, yeah, I live there. And he couldn't believe it. And as I drove through, I thought to myself, I wonder if he's ever driven through that checkpoint, if he's ever like passed over the threshold of the wall to understand that the people who live inside there aren't monsters. They're not gonna eat anybody alive. They're normal people. Yeah.
Many times we encounter those who don't know anything about the situation. Many times they will tell us, Am I in the West Bank or in Israel? So these questions will show that people are not aware of the context where they are visiting. Many times we tell them about the situation, what we are doing, why the wall is here. So they were bewildered. And many times we have even Germans who has an encounter with the German wall and they say, we thought that there will be no wall after the Berlin Wall, and now we see that wall.
They spend more time in waiting on the lines or on the queue more than the time when they go to visit the stars where Jesus was born. Bethlehem is the place where Jesus was born. Bethlehem under the Palestinian Authority now. So if you want to consider Bethlehem as part of Israel, then you have to have a lesson in history.
You know, I have my own olive trees. In the past, when you don't have developed irrigation system, when you need to carry the water either on donkeys or with buckets and to move towards miles of miles, and to water it for the first 5 years, you know, in such a mountainous area. How much struggle, how much suffering, how much sacrifice you have raised this olive tree to nourish it with love, with agape, with passion, with compassion, and to have the resilience and the perseverance that you will eat from its fruits in the coming years, and the generations to come will do it also. And most of our orchards have been taken by settlements, by security, dividing the land, depriving us from our land, from our orchards, and this is very painful and a bleeding wound that has not been healed. And the tree, which goes back to 2,000 years when Jesus wept, you know, in the Garden of Gethsemane. I believe Jesus is still weeping on the trees uprooted.
I know there is a lot of talk about, you know, Middle East, this issue of maybe disagreement between Muslims and Christians, but it doesn't exist here.
One thing that we find to be more evident and clear every year is that nonviolence is more of a threat to the Israeli occupation than violence itself. And my oppressor, my occupier, the Israeli occupation also deserves security, they deserve peace, but not at the expense of the Palestinian livelihood and lives. And so the only means to achieving and realizing sovereignty, to achieving a state of stability in which I feel that my rights as a Palestinian are guaranteed and respected is through the use of nonviolence.
We try to solve everything with peace and love. And in the Bible it says, love your enemy, and we have to. It's hard to do it with the occupation here. It's hard to just love our enemy, especially for the families that have lost their loved ones in the war or they're in prison now. It's hard for them.
I look at Christians here and I see that they found a way to hold on to hope, even though it seems far off, even though it seems unreachable or unmanageable. I mean, they're still living, they're still dreaming, they're still thinking about a future. And that's inspiring to me.
Hand in hand, we should pray for peace and love for the world.
If we can act as Christians as a bridge, way of reconciliation, and in creating some sort of stability and peace among people, then we should do that, and we are doing that.
The Christians here are the living stones of the country. As people, Christians, we always pray for peace because we want peace, not only for our generation, but for our children.
Jesus was a people person. He met people. He listened to stories. He cared. And oftentimes when I see these buses coming, they pass the checkpoint, they pass the separation wall, the refugee camps, and I usually wonder, do they care? If you really want to have an authentic experience in the Holy Land. There is nothing more than meeting with sisters and brothers and celebrating our unity, the spirit that unites us.
If you see someone that they are in need and you won't help them, you are not Christians. And that's why we are calling our sisters and brothers. If you want to come and visit the deadstones.com, if you need to come and hear the living stones, which we are the living stones as a Christian present in this land. We are calling the international to come and see.
Well, apologies for those wacky YouTube ads and for our reliance heavily on video this week. But hopefully this gives us all a bit more context as we try to wrap our brains around this crisis. Context about how we evaluate whether actions in a war are just, some historical context about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the last 100 years or so, and then hearing some of the various perspectives of our siblings in Christ who are living their lives in Palestine. So again, none of this quite deals with the present situation, but we're getting there. So please do continue to write your comments on the notepads, and I can collect those. Folks who are watching online, either now or throughout the week, you can leave your comments and your questions in the Facebook chat on the live stream on Facebook, and we'll try to answer some of those questions as we go on. And thank you all so much. We will see you next time. But let's close in a brief prayer here. This is a prayer that comes from the Mennonite Central Committee, who are experts in peace and justice work. O God of life and love and peace, we witness the violence and injustice in your holy land, and our hearts break. Our hearts break for the people of Israel, for the victims of violent attacks by Hamas, for those who live with fear and insecurity, for those who suffer from the intergenerational trauma of violence. Our hearts break for Palestinians, for the victims of violent attacks by the Israeli military, for those being denied water, electricity, and medical care, for those who are refugees long displaced from their homes. We especially pray that weapons of war be laid down, that walls of separation be dismantled, that prisoners be released, that demonizing of the other cease, that political leaders seek the good of all people in Palestine and Israel. O God, whose heart breaks for the world, may your justice dwell in the land. May your righteousness abide in fruitful fields. May the effect of righteousness be quietness and trust forever. May the effect of justice be peace, enduring peace. Amen. All right, thank you, friends. Again, if you missed last week's class, it is online. And if you want to watch any of the videos again, I did put those links in the comments on the YouTube feed, or the Facebook feed, I'm sorry. Thank you, friends.